Hi, my name is Franz Hartmann. I'm the coordinator of the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance. Welcome to Off the Shelf Tools, a discussion of real world examples of green development standards being successfully used across the greater Golden Horseshoe. First, let me begin with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the land I am on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto, where I'm located, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. These are lands that were meant to be shared with nature and in a way that honors the life that we have been given. The history of this land clearly demonstrates that we have not lived up to these intentions or promise. To have hope for future generations, we have a sustainable world for them. We must recognize the value in each other, reconcile for past tragedies, and ensure compassionate care and concern for all. Further, we must recognize that the various components of our ecosystem, the air, land, water, flora, and fauna, are all interdependent and need to work in harmony. The only way forward is together. On behalf of the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance Steering Committee, including Anne Bell from Ontario Nature, Linda Lukasic from Environment Hamilton, and Kevin Thomason from the Grand River Environmental Network, who are joining us today, I would like to welcome you to today's seminar, our webinar. Welcome back to many of you who joined us last Thursday, and hello to those joining us for the first time. For those of you who are not familiar with the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance, we're a network of over 100 organizations, large and small, from across Ontario, but mostly within the greater Golden Horseshoe, working together to protect and expand Ontario's world-famous Greenbelt. One of the ways we do this is by working with community leaders, including elected local officials and their staff, to find ways to use planning tools to help overcome key local challenges in a way that also helps the Greenbelt, which is why we're here today. In February and March, we held regional webinars aimed at helping local councillors, mayors, and municipal staff navigate the municipal comprehensive review process in a way that is Greenbelt friendly. And one of the recurring comments we got from participants was, we want webinars on solutions, specifically what we can do right now to make sustainable communities. We heard you loud and clear, which is why we're here today. This is the second of 3 webinars aimed at solutions. You can sign up for the last one at www.greenbeltalliance.ca. Today, of course, we're focusing on off-the-shelf solutions, specifically green development standards. And let me now introduce our expert guide, Gabriella, or Gaby Kalapos. Gaby has been working to motivate and support local government action on clean air and climate change for over 20 years. Her passion has been on encouraging the uptake, transfer, and implementation of clean air and climate change actions, and the building of partnerships that enable collaboration and support between the community and all levels of government. Gaby is going to start with a presentation followed by a Q&A. So feel free to pop questions into the chat function at any time. I will get to them after Gaby finishes her presentation. Now over to you, Gaby.
Thanks, Franz. And thanks everyone for having me here today to talk to you about green standards. Really important conversation, and it's really great to see that we're getting a really good critical mass of green development standards getting implemented across municipalities. Sure. So I'll give you the little bit of the background information on green standards, how municipalities have made them work, what are the opportunities, what are the resources that can help municipalities do this so that it can, they don't have to start from scratch. There's a lot of opportunities for sharing across the municipalities to reduce the burden both on municipal staff as well as in terms of the research that's need to be undertaken to advance this. So I'll give you a little bit of the 101 on green standards, but this is really geared towards being a conversation. So please don't be shy. Ask your questions in the chat. If you do have a question that's related to any slide, please just kind of chime in and let me know, and we can get into that, kind of get some clarification. And then we can go into the discussions of what is it that you would need to help you advance the conversation of green development standards within your municipalities. So I'll start with just a little bit of background on who we are. The Clean Air Partnership is a charitable environmental organization, and our main modus operandi has been to help municipalities implement clean air and climate change actions, both on the mitigation front as well as on the resilience front. And we also developed the CAC municipal peer-to-peer network, which is at the staff level, and we help facilitate conversations across the Ontario Climate Caucus network on advancing the peer-to-peer exchange and sharings across the municipalities, also providing a bit of a support network for politicians as they're advancing climate actions within their municipalities, because one thing I have learned is we all need support groups as we're advancing this work. So what are green development standards? What it really comes down to is it clearly identifies what, from the right beginning of a development application, what are the sustainability metrics that the municipalities want to advance? So what is it that the municipalities are really geared towards? What do they want to achieve with their green development standards? I should also mention, it is only green development standards are only focused in on new developments, but there are other mechanisms that need to address the building sector as a whole. And we know that while new developments are absolutely critical, because everything we don't build to the right standards at present is only going to need to be retrofitted in about 10 to 15 to 20 years. And we know it's going to cost a lot more. So that really is geared towards addressing the new developments, setting the stage for where we are right now, where do we want to go, and what's the standards that we're going to kind of aim for and the timeframes we're going to aim for to achieve, to move from where we are to where we need to be. I should also mention, as a part of the whole thing on this one as well, is that one of the things that really is effective, and one of the unintended side impacts of green standards, is that they really help to address the silos that exist across our municipalities. So that planning is talking to stormwater is talking to climate, talking to transportation. There's a lot of silos that we are going to have to do a much better job of breaking down if we are going to act on our climate change opportunities. So what are the standards that municipalities are looking for? Now, a lot of one of the biggest ones that ends up getting a lot of airtime is on energy efficiency and GHG emissions. But I wanted to also highlight that's only one of a number of metrics that are associated with green development standards. There's other things related to how much soil is going to be kept on depth. How is it going to be addressing compact mixed use development? How is it going to be prioritizing intensification? How is the green streets or street amenities going to be? What kind of active transportation infrastructure is going to be available? What other access to green space? And all of these proximity to transit, all of these different elements are brought together so that the sustainability of all new developments are put through a criteria and identifying where they are and where they intend to be within a certain time period. So I should also mention another one of them is also how much precipitation is going to be dealt with on site. So why would you bother with all the work of green development standards? Well, it's absolutely critical in terms of following through on a climate emergency declarations that have been announced. Over 600 Canadian municipalities have declared climate emergencies and are all in the process of advancing in actions that will help them achieve the GHG reduction targets that they set for themselves. Our population is going to grow. We know that we're going to need more housing. How we get that housing and how we provide that housing and how much impact it has on the environment in terms of resource use or operational emissions that it releases or resilience opportunities that it brings on. All of those things are going to be absolutely critical. And if we don't achieve those standards in our new developments, it's going to make achieving them in our existing developments that much harder. So all the work we can do to build the best new, right from the point of construction, is only going to save not only our community residents, but all of us cost in terms of infrastructure and resource use. New buildings present an ideal opportunity. You're starting with a clean slate. You have the chance to really do it right from the get-go, and that's absolutely critical. on all of these fronts, because if you don't build it right in the first place, you know that you're only delaying the inevitable retrofits that you're going to have to achieve. And I'm not only talking about energy efficiency, but also the retrofits with regards to how much precipitation is dealt with on site, how is the roads going to be using, and what kind of public access to green space is going to be allocated. Is this something that the municipality is going to address right from the beginning of that development? Or is it something that's going to be demanded by the residents because it hasn't been planned for that? So as you can see, again, buildings are a good component of Ontario's GHG emissions. When we look at our own communities, we're looking at about 40 to 60% of our emissions coming from buildings within our communities. But even more important to the buildings itself is also where we build and how we build will have impacts on our GHG emissions, as well as the energy use associated with our transportation, as well as our infrastructure costs. So, what are the reasons why you would bother with a green development standard? I think one of the things that I think that has come out from a lot of the municipalities' experiences is that no doubt it is more work to develop a green development standard right from at the beginning. However, over the longer term, the effort put into the green development standards makes a significant difference in breaking down those silos across the different municipal departments, which will be absolutely critical to addressing our climate change challenges. So it really does kind of identify clearly for all of the developers right before they've even started planning exactly what sustainability metrics are municipalities looking for. And that is the best time for developers to bring that into their decision making and into their planning. What kind of metrics can they incorporate? Which ones will be hard for them? But the transparency to them is right at the beginning of the planning stage for them. This is something that already had taken place. This is one thing we've learned from the feedback from a lot of the municipalities. A lot of those negotiations for sustainability metrics were part of the development application process, but a lot of the times they were negotiated at the end of the planning application process, in which case it would actually require a lot of the developers to go back to the planning stage, and that's something they did not want to do. So having a green development standard in place clearly identifies with complete transparency exactly what the municipality is looking for, giving the maximum chance for developers to incorporate that into their developments. It also clearly identifies where you are right now and where you want to go, and provides resources and tools to your development community to help them go through that process. So one of the key things that often comes up is, what is the legislative authority? We get into a lot of discussions on the building code, what you can and cannot do. I just wanted to kind of highlight, green development standards are within the full authority of municipalities. It is not something that is something just, oh, sorry. It wasn't something that's really geared towards the City of Toronto. There were some kind of thoughts at one point that the City of Toronto was able to have their Toronto Green Standard because of something in the City of Toronto Act. Let me assure you, that is not correct. The only thing that's in the City of Toronto Act that's not in the Municipal Act is additional revenue tools that are available to the City of Toronto. But all of the City of Toronto's planning authorities are all within the Municipal Act as well, and it enables municipalities all across Ontario to advance green development standards. Those planning authorities come from the Planning Act, and they're related to the provincial policy statement. There is the requirement of incorporating the green development standards into municipal official plans. So there's amendments. So if you don't have it in your existing official plan, then you would need to set up an amendment that kind of triggers the Green Development Planning Act authorities in part of the green development standards. And then there's always the policy alignment and integration, which really comes down to it, not that while green development standards are absolutely critical in terms of getting them into your official plan, getting them put into the municipalities in terms of all of the different resources available for the planning folks, there's also the need to bring that all into the stormwater plans. They need to be integrated across all the different plans, so it's an all-of-government approach. The benefits of green development standards accrue to a whole bunch of different folks. I'll give it to the municipal government and taxpayer. There's using our land as efficiently as possible has huge implications in terms of our municipal financial sustainability over the long term. Our infrastructure deficit just didn't happen by accident. We have planning changes that we need to do to use our municipal infrastructure to the maximum extent possible. The environment benefits from this, either in terms of precipitation, how much is dealt with on site, flood risk reductions, which also benefit the homeowners as well. There's benefits from a public health perspective in terms of active transportation, green space allocations, and there's a variety of different benefits that accrue to different stakeholders across the municipality as part of green development standards. So what are they all geared towards? Minimizing GHG emissions, addressing infrastructure costs, preserving the natural environment, reducing resource use. Really, the goal that we all have is creating thriving, connected communities, and green development standards are one of the mechanisms and tools available to us to help to do that. Improving public health, either through the ensuring infrastructure for active transportation or connectivity to different destinations that residents would like to be kind of offering. In addition, it also provides transparency and certainty to developers on where we are right now and where we are going to be going over time, so that there's no surprises and they know the time frame associated with that. So some examples of the green development standards in play right now. Probably the most well-known one is the Toronto Green Standard, which is just actually going into TGS, the Toronto Green Standard in version 4. It's a tiered approach where tier 1 is mandatory, and then the higher tiers are voluntary, associated with the development charge rebates. In addition, every 3 to 4 years, the tier 1 drops off, and tier 2, which used to be a voluntary, becomes the mandatory standard. This is kind of like one of the best leading practices related to green standards, and it is something that is modeled after the Vancouver Green Standard, as well as the BC Step Code, and the National Model Building Code has followed this approach as well. The Whitby Green Standard follows the Toronto Standard in terms of a tiered approach as well, a tiered mandatory approach. So the first one is the tier 1, which is the mandatory requirement, and then tier 2 to 4 is voluntary. And then in a probably 2 years time period, tier 1 will drop off, and tier 2, which is now voluntary, will become the mandatory green standard for that as well. So it provides clarity to the development community on exactly what folks are looking for. In terms of helping you kind of wrap your brains around green standards, one of the things I think is sometimes really helpful is clearly identifying the metrics that are associated within green standards, because a lot of the times that we get examples and we get caught up in different types of specific metrics, and then lose sight of all the variety of different metrics that green development standards can help achieve. Another approach that is often can also be used is that they kind of create it so that you have a mandatory version versus a voluntary approach. It's very similar to the tiered standard, but it's actually usually just like 1 or 2 kind of mandatory and voluntary. There's another approach that's kind of the use of the menu approach that is being used, that has been used in, actually is still only being used in Vaughan and Halton Hills, but it is quickly being replaced by the prescriptive tiered approach, just because one of the things that is one of the issues that has been raised with the kind of pick your own green development standard is that it does provide a lot of flexibility to the development community, but it does also mean that the municipality can't guarantee that they're going to get uptake to the metrics that are particularly important to them. So there's an ability to bring the 2 different styles together if that's something that you think is more applicable to your municipality. But one of the key things that all the evidence has shown us thus far, that if you want to get uptake to all of your metrics, it's important to put a prescriptive tiered approach into play, so that there's uptake on your key metrics that you're aiming to get uptake on. So this is giving you a highlight just on how these tiered approach works. And then also just highlighting, this is kind of, again, the approach being used by the National Model Building Code, which is geared towards that you want to create alignment as much as you possibly can, so that your municipal green standards align with the provincial, ideally, building code, and hopefully it'll be improved upon in the coming months. It just had an ERO posting We haven't gotten a lot of increased ambition on the Ontario Building Code when it comes to energy efficiency. That would be a shame, because it would mean that our energy efficiency standards in Ontario would stagnate for about a decade, which is not what we need to be doing. So there is the need to do some increased engagement with the province to enable the building code to serve as a bigger, broader effort on greenhouse gas reductions. I also wanted to kind of highlight one of the things that's really, really critical as well when you're looking at your green development standard is don't only use an energy metric for your energy efficiency standard. There's a really important aspect of making sure that you bring in a GHG coefficient into your green standard. There's already in place. You can use the Toronto Green Standard. You can use the Whitby Green Standard. You can use the Markham Green Development Standard that's being developed as well, and I think being discussed in council today actually as well. And so there's a variety of different standards that you can use. You don't have to create your own. They really just align with everybody else's work. And it just ensures that you're putting in a GHG metric rather than just an energy efficiency metric. So this is just a little bit of background information. Just wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up in some of the kind of larger advocacy roles to make sure there is alignment between municipal green standards, Ontario Building Code, and National Model Building Code as well. So I also wanted to let you know as well, there was just a recent ERO posting to finalize the draft manual on low impact development. Two of the metrics that are often the biggest resistance factors within the development community are the energy efficiency requirement in green standards, as well as how much precipitation gets dealt with on site. Many municipalities have only been using the 5 millimeter requirement, which is a provincial requirement. But there is goals towards the green standards. We're moving into the 5, 15, and 25 millimeters. There's the low impact development guide that was sitting in with the provincial level has just it's sitting in draft mode at the provincial level, which was delaying a little bit of implementation on on the metrics or the ambition or the mandatory ambition of the metrics and on dealing with precipitation on site. So there's a lot of information taking place. We anticipate that there's going to be some updates to the metrics that are out in the market at present with regards to increased ambition on the low impact development and how much precipitation gets dealt with on site. Just wanted to kind of give you an idea. This is just to kind of make it a little bit more real in terms of the mandatory standards, how the voluntary standards, how it's demonstrated, who's responsible within the municipality for reviewing ensuring the compliance of that development, how that compliance will be identified and assured, and then the rationale for why this metric is important. I'm not saying green development standards have all the metrics that they should have as part of them. They don't. There is emerging metrics that we didn't yet have the common, consistent evidence that we needed to incorporate and make them mandatory within green standards. That's changing. An example of that was relating to some of the extreme wind associated with resilience in terms of new resilience standards. There is plans to bring in resilience into the 2025 National Model Building Code. But the question then comes in, are you going to be waiting for that, or are you going to be trying to ensure that the resilience of your developments are brought in at the beginning? And then embodied carbon is another area that we're really interested in advancing. There's some significant work taking place in terms of some research from the Builders for Climate Action, as well as from manifest on embodied carbon, and how can you bring that into your green development standards, and how can developers bring that into their decision making moving forward. Wanted to provide some examples of the green development standards already in market. Each of these logos are linked to where you can find some more information on their green standards, but it goes to show you that you're not starting from scratch here. There's ample resources and learnings from other jurisdictions to build on. In addition, there's upcoming green development decisions that are going to be put in front of council in the coming, I would say from a coming year. I think Markham's actually having their discussion today, but then the next year we're going to be seeing a lot more green development standards coming into front of municipalities as well. So one of the questions that comes up often is, what can a municipality do to incentivize higher tiers, not the mandatory, but the voluntary tiers, to move the market in that direction? So a number of different kind of opportunities for incentives, and there's pros and cons associated with all of them. Is community improvement plans is something that's going to be required as part of moving forward and on identifying opportunities for parkland dedication and within and planning, so that there is going to be the ability to identify these green development standards and incentives as part of your community improvement plans. There's the mechanism to use development charge rebates. There's tax and increment-based grants, so that you can kind of reduce the grant, the taxes associated with certain types of development for a certain time period or delay them. There's the expedited approval process, which is very, very popular with developers, not so much with planning folks, planning staff, just because of the burden already placed on them with regards to the deadlines associated with that. But it's just another option to consider. Recognition programs, I mean, that's one of the things that we have been trying to identify, is that, you know, it doesn't have to be done at the municipal level. Could we do something maybe at the regional level? Is there some sort of kind of more aggregated ability to recognize the developers who are going above and beyond requirements? One of the key things that many municipalities have been looking into, and developers are very, very keen on, is regarding the density and height increases. If they no longer need their mechanical systems on their rooftop, can they use that rooftop spaces out into their penthouse? And then they can deal with any upfront capital cost implications by increasing their pro formas and their ability to make their money, recoup their money. If they're really not going to be addressing any, if they're not worried about upfront capital, or if they're really not willing to go anything on upfront capital costs because they don't want to be uncompetitive in what is a very competitive market, there's the ability for municipalities to use LIC financing. What about the green premium associated with either LID or energy efficiency being applied to a green loan to that development that could then either be paid back via operational savings, and then that is paying for the upfront capital cost associated with the energy performance, or the LID, or other types of green sustainability metrics that has been incorporated into the municipality. So I did want to highlight, there's a Green Development Standards Toolkit, which is like everything you wanted to know on green development standards, but we're afraid to ask. That's available. It's the GDS Toolkit is available at that link. There's additional green development standards resources available. And please don't be shy. Feel free to reach out to me. We've been working with a lot of your staff on green development standards. We're also want to kind of get this as much as possible. There is no need to start from scratch. You know, and it is just such a compliment to all the other municipalities when other people use their resources. The goal on this is to get as many municipalities advancing green development standards as possible, and to reduce the burden on the development of green development standards within individual municipalities. So we're really keen to making sure that all of those sharings take place, and do not be shy about reaching out.
Okay, thank you, Gaby. Needless to say, but I will say it anyway, for those of you who may be thinking green development standards, green belts, you know, every time you do green things in your community, you are contributing, sometimes in a small way, but usually in a significant way, in helping preserve the green belt and adjacent lands to the green belt that are completely tied in ecologically to the green belt. So with that out of our way, with that presentation behind us, the floor is open. What I would ask is if you want to, just let me know through the chat function that you have a question for Gaby, and or put the question in the chat function. If you just say, I have a question, I'll ask you to unmute yourself when your turn comes, and we'll go from there. So while people are thinking about a question, just to make it clear, we will be sharing Gaby's presentation. We will be posting this webinar sometime in the next while. I can't say it's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 days, but for sure by the end of next week. So people will have access to that great presentation and will be able to review this again or send their friends to this link. Okay, first question is from Alex Waters in Innisfil. In Toronto, what percentage of new builds participate in the volunteer standards?
I don't actually have the percentage that go in for the tiers 2 or 3 because there's only 3 tiers right now in the green standard. I'm not going to say it's like, you know, a majority of folks. The large majority of the developments do choose the tier 1, which is the mandatory approach. There's no doubt about it. But there's always leading developers who are willing to take on the tiers 2 and 3, and in that way they build their own capacity. In addition, it helps give them market differentiation, and their learnings also get shared with amongst other developers so that we can learn what's going to be required in order to move this from the voluntary approach to the mandatory approach. So I'm not gonna say it's anything close to the majority. The large majority of the green standards uptake is to the tier 1 mandatory approach, and there's a handful of folks who build into the higher tiers. But the important thing is that's really important. You got to get some uptake on leading developers who go to the voluntary tiers, but you don't need maximum compliance with the voluntary tiers. What you need to show is that it's being built and that it can be done, and that these are opportunities for moving forward, and then taking those learnings from those developers who are going higher, so that you can then build up the resources and capacity to support that moving towards a mandatory approach. And the incentives play a big role. I'm not going to lie as well. I don't think Toronto has gotten, I know, at least 10 applications for voluntary tiers in the last little while, but I also know that their development charge rebate is important to many of the developers going for higher tiers as well. So using the incentives that are available is something that's going to drive increased uptake to those voluntary tiers. So that we've seen in reality happen. Those incentives do make a huge difference.
Okay. Floor is open for others who have questions. Here is, my apologies if I'm mispronouncing this, Darren Somas from City of Hamilton. Thank you for the amazing information, Gaby. 2 questions that I have is, what have you seen as the most popular metrics that is being used across the municipalities? So most popular metrics. And number 2, what metrics would you see municipalities focus on that make the greatest impact to reducing emissions?
I will also kind of put a caveat on this one. When you're doing your green development standards, it means you have already identified where you're going to be building. So it doesn't address, like, green development standards don't address in terms of like the overall growth management strategy, official plans, or official plans. That is absolutely critical still to be dealing with. The green development standards will not be addressing natural capital resources, not natural capital valuation, what kind of ecosystem services are provided by the land. That is something that still needs to be done in terms of natural capital valuation, in terms of asset management, natural capital asset management being brought into the municipal decision making. I would also say that one of the key things that I think is absolutely critical is that when municipalities are doing their development cost studies, don't only look at your initial upfront capital growth costs. Look at how much it costs you to service those different developments, the different development archetypes. Look at how much it's going to cost you to rehabilitate that infrastructure when you absolutely inevitably come to that stage when that infrastructure needs to be rehabilitated, and how much are those property taxes paying their way in those infrastructure renewal costs. And comparing it not just averaged across your municipality, but based on different types of archetypes. What does it mean to the kind of Main Street or downtown core? What does it mean to those kind of different densities associated with which developments are holding their own in terms of their rehabilitation costs, and which ones are going to need to be subsidized? So I did want to kind of highlight green development standards. once a municipality has identified exactly where they're going to grow and where they're not going to grow, green development standards are absolutely a perfect mechanism for advancing the sustainability of those developments. But when you have that conversation, I think that don't forget that that's absolutely a critical part of the conversation. In terms of which metrics we get a lot of uptake in the voluntary approach, which metrics get uptake from the development community when there's no mandatory requirement on them, the developers aren't stupid. They often choose the cheapest ones for metrics for them to do that gives them the maximum amount of points, and then they do those cheapest ones. So you'll find a lot of active transportation, infrastructure. It's the same thing we've learned from the LEED approach, that if you make it too easy for them to achieve their standards, you're not going to get the outcomes you hope for in terms of your green development standards. Having said that, you can still do a kind of approach where you make the metrics that you're particularly interested in getting uptake on, and which ones make the most difference in energy efficient and sustainability. I would say how close you are to amenities, how close you are to public transit, how close you are to green space, how close you are to what's the energy performance or GHG performance of the building, how much precipitation is dealt with on site. Those metrics are probably the most critical metrics, because they make a huge difference, and not only in terms of operational costs for the property owner, but they make a huge implications for the infrastructure costs associated with the municipal cost as well. And they're often the hardest ones to get uptake from the development community. So moving forward on them and putting a lot of, if you use a point system, putting a lot of points to those metrics so you drive uptake, or making them mandatory.
Okay, great. Next question is, and my apologies if I mispronounce your name, Niharika Bandaru from the town of Innisfil. Thank you for the great presentation. Are the development charges rebates effective as a long-term approach to incentivizing green development? Pros versus cons, please.
So the pros is it does drive uptake from the development community. The con is that it does have financial implications for municipalities for hard costs that they have to deliver on in terms of the development costs that they have to deliver on. So those are kind of the two often main ones that come into it. Are they a long-term strategy? I would say that a lot of the times we've had conversations with a lot of municipalities, and you'll find a lot of municipalities are not willing to give development cost rebates. They already feel that the development doesn't pay its own way, that this is something that's a hard cost that has to be covered somehow, some way, and they don't think it's fair that the property tax base should pay for it and that developers should get a rebate on it. So that's one kind of the pros and cons of it. Associated with that, there is other mechanisms. I am a big fan of using being a little bit more creative. I really been trying to work with some of the municipalities on advancing an incentive that is geared towards, let's just say we get a geothermal system in a building, then they don't need their HVAC systems on the roof. Can we give that over as a saleable space, which then kind of drives a really strong incentive for developers to achieve the metrics that we're looking to. Same thing that could be done for LID. If they really go on the LID and they deal 25 millimeters of precipitation on site, can we forego the need for a stormwater pond and then move over that stormwater pond allocation to development or to other types of kind of uses that would then kind of compensate the additional upfront costs associated with the LID. There's different kind of mechanisms. I don't think that there's any one silver bullet incentive. There is going to have to be, that's probably one of the biggest conversations that need to take place within municipalities and with the development community, to finding what they're looking for, to seeing what works for them and what also doesn't put an onerous financial burden on the municipality.
Okay, next question from Linda Swanston from Grey County. Are there Ontario municipalities currently using LIC financing to support GDS or Green Development Standards implementation?
Not as yet for new developments. That's something a lot of municipalities are right now focusing on, building the foundation for their retrofit programs, which number of them will be aiming to use or are using or will be using local improvement charge mechanisms There's nothing that, once that foundation is built up, there is nothing stopping us from applying the LIC to new builds. There's a little bit of a caveat in the sense that the legislation for new builds requires the property owner to voluntarily agree to the LIC being attached to the property. And technically, when you're a new development, the property owner may not be the one signing on to that. So one of the workarounds for that is enabling the property owner to either pay their LIC at time of purchase, or B, attach it to their mortgage when they take possession of the property, or 3, attach it to their property tax for repayment. Therefore, they would be voluntarily agreeing to the LIC before it was forced upon them. So there's mechanisms to meet the needs of the LIC legislation, while also recognizing that this is something that makes sense for the property owner, especially when it reduces operational costs, and especially as a lot of more municipalities are looking at stormwater fees and application of stormwater fees, because that will also have operational savings for those properties that are going above and beyond on addressing how much precipitation they deal with on site.
Great. Next question from Kevin Thomason in Waterloo. What's the most common mistake municipalities make getting started with green development standards? And how can we best ensure that we avoid it here locally as we bring GDS forward in the coming months?
Probably the 2 biggest kind of issues that a lot of municipalities face is they don't make the energy efficiency metric voluntary. They get caught up in their ability to enforce that requirement. So as a green development standard, what's the requirement that municipalities are placing on the developers is that they have to submit an energy modeling report for how that development will achieve this energy or GHG performance. That modeling report is part of the full complete development application. Some municipalities get caught up in the fact that, let's just say that development doesn't build it to that standard. Are they able to withhold an occupation permit because of that not meeting that performance standard? Now, that hasn't been put into test yet, because I don't know of anyone who has withheld a building permit for energy efficiency requirements, because a lot of times you can't verify the energy modeling report until you get some data of actually how the building is being used. So you need time to verify that as well. Hence the reason that I don't believe that green development standards are a silver bullet. We absolutely need to have energy disclosure, energy benchmarking as part of the longer term strategy, so that we can identify which buildings are performing according to their energy modeling report and which ones aren't, and why, and what can we do to help address that performance gap. So that's one of the areas people kind of say, like, oh, we can't require above and beyond Ontario Building Code. And you can, because you can ask for anything as part of your energy modeling report that you ask for a development application. You could go into how much enforcement is the municipality going to do, but I'm not sure that the purpose of green development standards is to withhold building occupation permits. That's not the goal of them. It's to work with the development community to identify for them what is it that municipalities are looking for, and where are they now, and what do they need to drive them towards a destination on this metric that we're all trying to aim for. So I think this really fosters this dialogue. You cannot make it mandatory, which is what some municipalities have done on energy performance or on LID. But what we've seen happens then is you get no uptake from the development community. So the question is, you're going to use it as an education opportunity, or you're going to get caught up in your kind of enforcement authorities and lose this education opportunity.
Great. Just to let people know, we've got one more question, and then there's some more time left. So please, for people, pose your questions in the chat function, please. Linda Lukasic from Hamilton writes, thanks for highlighting the need to pay attention to a GHG metric rather than just an energy efficiency metric. It got me thinking about the trend in a growing number of jurisdictions to ban methane gas hookups in new buildings and ultimately phase out of existing buildings. Toronto has indicated it is heading in this direction. Is there any sign of fossil fuel hookup bans emerging in Ontario municipal GDSs? What are the challenges with implementing this idea in Ontario?
Good question. There hasn't been any kind of methane bans in new developments just as of yet. There is a lot of work taking place within, especially those municipalities that have green development standards in play, to work with the developers as part of, let's say, for example, in Halton Hills, in Georgetown, or in Brampton Heights in Brampton, which is the kind of bigger developments that are taking place at the block level, and working across developers to see what kind of community energy opportunities are available, or what can be done at the community scale that goes beyond just the individual developments or the individual developers. So I'd say that that's one approach that's being used by a number of municipalities, is working across the developers in a specific geographical area to see what can be done to meet the energy needs without bringing in fossil fuel infrastructure into that. So that's one mechanism available to municipalities to work on that one. There traditionally has not been any municipal authorities related to deciding what utilities go in and what utilities don't go in. So that's not been a traditional area that municipalities have engaged in the past. Them being engaged in their community energy is relatively new, with green standards being one of the mechanisms that they use to do so, and their community energy plans or climate action plans being the other mechanism that they use to advance this conversation with their community residents and the developers. There is new climate change bylaw authorities that were incorporated into the 2018 Municipal Act that have not been put into action just as yet. That there is the need. I'm not a municipal lawyer, so I can't say whether, these conversations on what those climate change bylaw authorities can or cannot be. They're extremely vague in the Municipal Act on what they can or can't be. Which then puts a little bit more kind of responsibility on the municipalities in many ways to identify what is it you would want a climate change bylaw to achieve for you. And if it is a methane ban in new developments, how are you going to work with the development community to ensure that those energy needs are met in a way that doesn't kind of put an additional kind of financial burden? Because I think that's going to be one of the things that we do have to face on this. We've got to do a better job of understanding the overall costs and how are we going to meet it. So like let's say right now, if you wanted to build a new development, you just need to make one phone call to your electrical utility, one phone call to the natural gas, and the wires and the methane pipelines come in, and that's it. Your energy planning here is done. But if you want to build a low carbon community, you now have to work with a developer or bring in an energy developer and work with the developer, or the developers need to become energy developers, which is a whole new system that needs to be created. So the green development standards have been used as the mechanism to increase the dialogue with developers on how are we going to move towards lower carbon opportunities. And I will say that by the time we reach right now at the tier 1, the mandatory approach for the city of Toronto, you could probably still get by bringing in fossil fuel infrastructure, but I can assure you that when the next tier 2 becomes the mandatory tier 1, there is no way for you to bring in methane infrastructure into that development and meet that standard. Like, it's just not possible to meet your GHG standards by still bringing in fossil fuels into new developments. So green standards are used as a kind of mechanism to drive that movement towards reducing or eliminating methane and fossil fuel infrastructure in new developments. But there's also another aspect of possibly using your climate change bylaw authorities to do that. I would encourage that a lot of these discussions need to happen with the legal folks within municipalities. And I will admit, legal folks are often notoriously risk adverse. And so if it's not clearly stated on what it can do, then they say it can't do anything. But also those legislation is very kind of open-ended for a municipality to decide for themselves how they want to use their climate change bylaw authorities. So it's a really worthwhile discussion that I think will be a big part of the next number of years as municipalities dig into what are the mechanisms that they need, what are the authorities that they need to have in order for them to act on their climate change opportunities. And I do see, fossil fuel kind of phase out in new developments being a critical conversation for all of us to have.
Okay, another question from Hamilton. This one from Darren Somas of the City of Hamilton. What types of consulting have municipalities done in implementing their GDS? Whom do they consult with, and at what stage do they bring various stakeholders, I guess, to the table?
So I'd say the first number of municipalities who advanced the green development standard used external consultants. It's really great to see now that I think that there's enough kind of a critical mass of municipalities and resources that I'm not sure that they need to bring in consultants for that research. We are happy to connect you up with your peers in other jurisdictions who have developed green development standards, who can give you their stories and their processes. There's a methodology that's in the Green Development Standards Toolkit that takes you through the step-by-step process. I would say some of the kind of key critical issues that absolutely have to be done at the individual municipal level that being able to use from other jurisdictions won't really help you is the internal consultation across your different departments to develop your implementation plan for how development applications will be verified that they're meeting the green development standard. That's something that I think every municipality will have to do in terms of those internal departmental discussions. I have to say that one of the things we've also heard back from the development community as a unintended benefit of green development standards is that in many ways, a lot of the development applications are receiving kind of overall review at the same time across the different departments, which enables the developers, which we've heard back from some of the developers saying, this is great because we're not getting conflicting input from different departments, like the climate department wanting to achieve this, but then stormwater not saying, no, you can't do that. So that was one of the things that was a frustration part on the developers component. Whereas the green development standards has that kind of joint review across different departments has reduced those conflicting messages that come back to the developers. So that's one of the kind of benefits that I didn't highlight before. So I think that if you're going to use consultants, you probably don't need it for the internal consultation team. That would be probably either whoever the lead department is in green development standards development, which is usually the planning department. That's something that needs to be part of it. Whether you do that internally or whether you bring in a consultant to help you, that's one thing. But the other area that I think that there might be, again, this conversation about whether do you want to do it internally or do you want to get some consulting help to do it, is the external developer consultations that you inevitably have to do as you're advancing your green development standard. There's no way around it. You got to do that internal, that development sector consultations. That might be one area where you might want to bring in some consultants to help you do it. But I don't necessarily say that it's something that you absolutely have to have a consulting budget to do. It absolutely helps when you have that help coming into it. But even if you don't have it, it doesn't mean that it can't be done as an internal effort. I can just say that Ottawa just did their green development standard and they didn't use any consultant. They just did it in-house. But for smaller municipalities that may not have the capacity within their planning departments, it would make sense to bring in some consulting help, especially with regards to the developer stakeholder, if that's something that you think might be more challenging for the municipality.
Okay, well, we are coming to the top of the hour, almost 5 o'clock. And I want to say, first of all, Gaby, thank you so much for your presentation. Extremely helpful. I suspect everybody here learned a lot. I also want to invite all the participants to join us for our third webinar, which is a week Thursday on June 21st. It's called Building Complete Neighborhoods with Gentle Density, the Portland Example. And I want to let you know that today's webinar, along with some of the resources that Gaby mentioned, will be available on the OGA website in the coming days. When it's ready, I'll send an email out to all of you and others who registered. I also want to invite you to visit the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance website at www.greenbelt.ca, where you can find a variety of resources about planning in Greenbelt friendly ways. As well, please contact me if you have any follow-up questions for Gaby. I'll gladly pass those on to her if you don't want to connect with her directly. And finally, for those of you who have joined us for the first time, we hope today is the beginning of an ongoing dialogue which will lead us towards a future where your local needs are met in a way that helps our Greenbelt. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Gaby, and I wish you all a good afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, Franz, and thanks everyone for the opportunity. Have a good day.